Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here today to introduce and welcome Jason Jennings, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Jason Jennings is here today to discuss his new book, Hit the Ground Running, a Manual for New Leaders. The toughest job in business is taking over as a new leader. You have to quickly assess the situation, pull together a strong team, decide on a strategy, and inspire everyone to execute it. Jennings and his research team searched for new leaders who had pulled off the most impressive transformations of this decade, those who doubled revenues, doubled profit margins, and tripled earnings per share. He delivers their hard-earned, battle-tested strategies in his book. Jason Jennings was the youngest radio station group owner in the world, and his unique and legendary programming, sales, and management strategies are credited with revolutionizing many parts of the broadcasting industry. USA Today named Jennings as one of the three most in-demand business speakers. So please join me in welcoming Jason Jennings to Microsoft. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Oh, come on. I came from Lagos, Nigeria to be here. I can certainly get a better good afternoon than that, can't I? One more time. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, that's better. It's a pleasure to be here. Every time I hear a speaker or an author begin by saying it's a pleasure to be here, those words always sound very disingenuous to me because I figure they probably begin every speech or presentation by using the exact same words. But my experience with Microsoft goes back about 7 years. After my first book came out, I guess 8 years ago, I got hired to be the opening and closing keynote speaker at a worldwide Microsoft OEM conference. And that was the first event I did with Microsoft. There have been a number of events since that point, and I'm also a raving fan. I was telling some people earlier, there is no way that I could do what I do, the research-intensive nature of what I do, and the writing that I do without the products that you've given me. And so when I say I'm a raving fan of Microsoft, I mean that quite sincerely. I have had a very strange couple of weeks, and Lagos, Nigeria was actually the most normal part of the last couple of weeks. Let me tell you a couple of things that happened. I don't do jokes because I'm not a comedian, but a couple of weeks ago, I was in Dallas, Texas to do a speech for 1,000 CEOs in the jewelry business. And these were CEOs of retailers, manufacturers, and distributors. And they've been meeting for 3 weeks, and 3 days. And I was going to be the closing speaker. And the way it was going to work is they were going to have a cocktail reception from 6 until 7. I was speaking from 7 until 8, and then they were going to have a big gala dinner from 8 o'clock onward. So the bars opened up at 6, and everybody's drinking. And at 7, everybody's still drinking. And at 8 o'clock, everybody's still drinking. And I'm tugging on the arm of the guy who's supposed to introduce me. Don't you think you better get me on pretty quick? And the guy, yeah, I'll get here and run away. So he gets on stage, slurring his words. Please welcome New York Times best-selling author Jason Jennings. I walk on stage, I look out at the audience. By the way, honest to God, I look at the audience and I say, good evening. And somebody in the back of the room shouts, shut up. I mean, what do you do? I thought, well, I got to start again. So I said, well, let's try that one more time. I mean, good evening. And the same voice shouts out, I said, shut up. We don't need no stupid speakers. We need strippers like we used to have. And the whole room starts going, strippers, strippers, strippers. I mean, you know, how do you recover from that? It came down exactly that way. Now, it gets better. The next day, and the second thing that happened is an indication of what will happen to you in your life if you start to take yourself too seriously. The next day, I had to get from Dallas, Texas, to West Palm Beach, Florida for a speech at the Breakers Hotel. And the only way to do that is on Delta Airlines through Atlanta. So I get on board the airline in Dallas, and we're sitting and waiting, and nobody's saying anything. or it's a half hour late, an hour late, hour and a half late. Finally, the captain comes on and he says, I've got good news and bad news. He said, the good news is we're going to Atlanta. He said, the bad news is we've been trying to fix the toilets for the past 2 hours. We can't get them fixed, so you're not going to be able to use the bathrooms. Well, I'd had like 4 bottles of water that morning, so it's going to be a mite of a problem for me. So just hold it. So we fly into Atlanta. I've got to go to the bathroom. I mean, so bad. I'm running down the T concourse looking for a men's room. I finally see one. I run in, and all the urinals have yellow caution tape across them because they're replacing the tile behind them. And I thought, that's okay, man, I'll use a stall. So I take my roller bag and my backpack, I work my way into a stall, turn around, hang the backpack up, turn around, and just as I do, a voice comes from the stall next to me, and the voice says, hi, how are you? And I'm going, Senator? I mean, you know, like, is that you? And I said, I'm fine. And the voice from the next stall says, what are you up to? And I said, I'm traveling just like you. And the voice from the next stall says, can I come and hang out for a while? And I said, I'm sorry, I'm tied up right now. And the voice from the next stall says, honey, I got to get off the phone. There's some pervert in the next stall. And every time I ask you a question, he answers me. Just keep your eyes open as you go through life, and there will be plenty to talk about. I am, and thanks to everybody joining us online too. I am, but how do they buy books if they're watching online? Anyway, I am one of those rare authors that loves to, I love to research. And I don't multitask very well. But when I'm researching, I love the research process. When I'm writing, there is nothing in the world I would rather do than the writing process. But unlike a lot of other authors who don't feel good about it, I'm equally comfortable once the book is done talking about it and promoting it, because a book is of no value unless it gets into the hands of a lot of people and influences a lot of people. So I'm happy to talk about my latest book, Hit the Ground Running. First of all, let me tell you exactly what the book is, how the book came into being, but I always like to deliver some meat as well. And so I'm going to share with you 5 or 6 specific findings from the book that I believe that most or all of you will be able to use. I like to provide some takeaway. For my last books, and it's really what led me to this book. The first book I wrote 8.5 years ago was titled, It's Not the Big That Eat the Small, It's the Fast That Eat the Slow. And it was a study of 40,000 companies. We quantified speed and identified the fastest companies in the world. Speed, it turns out, has nothing to do with physical speed or moving physically faster. Speed had everything to do with thinking fast, deciding fast, getting to market fast, and the ability to maintain momentum. The book was a big bestseller. I found myself back in New York with my publisher, and he said, I have your next book. And I said, what's my next book? And he said, your next book is going to be about productivity. And I said, I am not writing a book about productivity. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, speed was sexy. Everybody went out and bought the book on speed. Who's going to buy a book on productivity? I mean, except some college professors. And he said, Jason, can you define productivity? And I said, sure, productivity, doing better. He said, Jason, that's not the definition of productivity. He said, productivity is decreasing the input while increasing the output. And he said, there's not a business in the planet that doesn't have to constantly strive to wring out waste and constantly be more productive, or one day they'll become an irrelevance. We studied 44,000 companies around the world, evaluated them based on revenue per employee per year, operating income per employee per year, and return on assets and return on invested capital per employee per year, and identified the 10 most productive companies on the planet. The book after that, Think Big, Act Small, my last book, which came out about 2.5 years ago, studied the only 10 companies in America who had managed to increase their revenues double digits organically, annually, for 10 years without a miss, while simultaneously growing their profits double digits every year for those same 10 years. And for that book, we studied every publicly traded company in the world. There are 22,000 of them, and the nation's 50,000 largest privately held companies. So I'm very research-based. About 2 years ago, I get together with my publisher in New York, and he said, all right, what's the next book? And I said, you know, I've always written about companies in the past. I said, I really want this book to be about people. because I said, Adrian, one of the big things I've discovered is that these great companies that I wrote about were great companies because of the great people that either founded them or led them or managed them. And I said, in the final analysis, it comes down to people. And he said, well, how would you figure out which people to write about? Because I am not one of those authors. I don't like most business books because I believe there are two primary genres of business books. One, written by academics who have no real world experience, and their books are primarily intended to impress other academics. And the other form of business book I find is where somebody comes up with an idea for a title and then goes out in search of confirming evidence. My problem with that is, with 300 million people in America and 40 million businesses, you can pretty much go out and confirm anything that you want to. And so I like to begin a book with an empty canvas and say, I know nothing about this situation, I know nothing about this subject, let's figure out how to quantify it, let's find the best, and then let's get inside. So when he said, who are these people? I said, well, here's what I'd like to do. I said, I think that leadership over the past decade has changed significantly. For those of you who are familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley, which went into effect in 2001, it basically said this: every CEO of a company had to sign the financial statements and personally attest to the accuracy of the data inside the document. And if it was later determined that it was inaccurate, this guy can go to jail, or this woman can go to jail, exactly where they ought to be. So before the year 2000, you couldn't compare financial performance and financial statements of companies because it was like comparing apples to oranges. A lot of companies' financial statements were fairy tales, little more than fairy tales. I mean, it's world-renowned that Xerox needed to find an extra $800 million in operating income, and they just said, shit, let's just create it. And they did. And as you recall, they paid about a $500 million fine and went on to serve under a consent decree with the SEC for a number of years. So I said, what I want to do is this. I don't want to go before 2000 because I don't want to deal with dinosaurs. Plus, Sarbanes-Oxley changed everything. But I want to find new CEOs who took over companies since the year 2000, who have been there at least 3 years or are still there. And then we want to go through and do computations by hand on which of these CEOs created the greatest amount of economic value. And we defined economic value the way you have to. You got to use share price, because ultimately, I don't believe the share market or the stock market's fair in the short term, but in the long term, I think it factors in the bad news and the good news and the future prospects, and you got to use something. So we evaluated these companies based on the value these CEOs created. So out of the 11,000 publicly traded companies in America, there were about 3,800 with new CEOs. There were about 3,200 that were still serving in the job. And so these are the companies that we did the computations on, and then we had to gain access. Now let me tell you, this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. For my past books, I found that contacting a company and saying, we want to write about your company, that's not that hard. There might be a little resistance at first, but they cave in pretty quickly because they recognize the public relations benefit they're going to get from being in a best-selling book. But we couldn't lie and tell these people we want to write about their companies. We had to be upfront and say, we want to write about your CEO, and your CEO is the focus. I will begin by telling you that every single one of the 10 companies we identified, every one of the 10 CEOs said, no. No, it's not going to happen. The corporate communications departments said no. The assistants to the CEOs said no. The CEOs themselves said no. Nobody was going to be in the book. Well, then you got a little problem. If you've taken a big chunk of money from the publisher to write a book, and I mean, nobody's going to talk to you. I had a dream that the publisher sent some dude named Three Fingers out to my house, and Three Fingers said, either give us the money back or give us a damn manuscript. So I knew I had to get in. We eventually gained access to every CEO, and I will just say that it was painful and hard. But once we got inside, the CEOs were incredible. And what we did is myself and my 4 young MBA research assistants generated more than 100,000 pages of interview transcripts with these CEOs. We sat there and basically said, tell us your story. Well, where do you want us to start? At the beginning. Well, I was born in Enderlin, North Dakota. All right, that's a good start. Start there. And what happened next? And what happened next? And what happened next? And that's all I had to say for the days that we interviewed these people. What happened next? And what brought you here? And then what happened next? And what did you do next? So 100,000 pages is a lot of transcripts to generate, a lot of pages of transcripts to generate. And I then sat down with my research team, and we spent several weeks going through 100,000 pages with yellow highlighters, reading them and going, boring, 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 aha, highlighted, boring, 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 aha. And we ended up with several thousand pages of aha moments from our interviews. And then we said, all right, now what did we find in common? What jumped out at us about these companies? And we were eventually able to attribute 10 traits or 10 characteristics and 10 things these CEOs did to achieve such incredible growth in their organizations. And so the book is not organized into actually 10 chapters. The book is organized into 10 rules. And these are the rules that these people followed to achieve the incredible performance of their organization. There's actually a story behind the name of the book, too. I always have difficulty coming up with titles for books. I don't know how some folks do it. They got to be a lot smarter than I am. And eventually, the titles for my books generally come from the people I'm writing about. For the book Think Big, Act Small, I was weeks overdue for a title. The manuscript was finished. And I was sitting down with a woman who was the president of Sonic Drive-Ins. And I said, Patty, what's allowed you to achieve this with this company for 25 years? And she looked at me and she said, oh, that's simple. She said, we think big, but we act small, because the moment you start acting, and I went, shit, there's the title, Think Big, Act Small. And that's where the titles generally occur. Well, let me tell you where the title for this occurred. The publisher was pushing me. The manuscript was essentially finished, and we didn't have a title. And so the publisher calls up and he says, look, I mean, you know, we need a title and we need it in the next several days. So I got the research team together and I said, gang, we need a title. And I said, the only way I can think to come up with a title is this. These CEOs have a lot of things in common, but what is the single one biggest thing that they all shared in common that just absolutely jumps out at us? And Vivek raised his hand and he said, I know what it is. He said, these people did not take over their companies and hire cadres of consultants or spend months gazing at their navel. He said, these folks, and then Grace Tan said, I know what they did. They all hit the ground running. And I said, geez, that's it. Hit the ground running. And that's how the accidental way by which we came up with the title of the book. Let me share some of the, I think, obviously I have to think because I wrote the book, fascinating content of the book and fascinating discoveries we made. I will tell you to begin, I know a lot of you went to business school, a lot of you have MBAs. Almost everything you're going to hear me talk about bucks conventional wisdom and flies in the face of conventional wisdom and is going to fly in the face of everything you were taught in business school or that any of us have ever been taught about leadership. I would suggest two things about conventional wisdom. I have never known conventional wisdom in the history of the planet to achieve unconventional results. At its best, conventional wisdom seemingly will give you conventional results, but I will also suggest that conventional wisdom is what's brought us to the edge of a bloody financial abyss and has us peering over the edge. So you're not going to be hearing a lot about conventional wisdom today because it's, frankly, not what we discovered. One of the first companies we identified, and you might get a chuckle, I mean, my Lord, how come Microsoft's not in the book? How in the world could you put J.M. Smucker in the book? Smucker jams and jellies. Now, they've been around for 100 years. Everybody grew up with them. And you might say, how in the world could you say that J.M. Smucker hit the ground running if they've been around for 100 years selling jams and jellies? Well, let me tell you. On the death of the previous CEO in the year 2000, two brothers were appointed co-CEOs, Tim and Richard Smucker. That year, the company did $500 million, and they were product leaders in a single category, jams and jellies. 8 years in the future, they were doing $5 billion a year, and they were had product leadership positions in 8 cutthroat grocery categories. And if you ever want to play in a cutthroat industry, try taking a position of supremacy, in groceries. It's damn difficult. How did they go from $500 million in revenues to $5 billion, and from leadership in one area to leadership in 8 over 8 years? Well, that was the first question, as I sat down with Tim and Richard Smucker, that I asked them. And they said, well, the reason for our success, and remember, this flies in the face of what you were taught at business school. They said the reason for our success really is because we follow the golden rule. And they said, Jason, do you know the golden rule? And I said, well, of course I know the golden rule. I went to Sunday school every Sunday as a kid growing up. And they said, well, Jason, what is the golden rule? And I said, well, the golden rule is as ye sow, so shall ye reap. And they said, well, that's part of it. Do you know the important words that go before that? And I said, no, I only was taught that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. And they said, oh, no, Jason. The important words, I said, no, that's from Galatians. I said, I don't know a lot about the Bible, but I know it's from Galatians, and it says, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. They said, yes, it's in Galatians, Jason, but you just dropped the most important words at the front of it. And I said, what are they? And Tim looked at Richard, and they're not overtly religious by any stretch of the imagination. They said, do you think there's a Bible someplace in the campus? They located a Bible, they brought it in, they turned to Galatians, and the chapter and the verse, and they said, here, Jason, read it out loud. And I read the words. Does anybody know the other words that go before it? Here are the words. It says, do not be deceived. God shall not be mocked. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. They said, Jason, the most important words in that biblical passage is that nobody should ever try to deceive themselves, because whoever or whatever as a supreme power is there is not going to be mocked. They're not going to close their eyes and wink while you do it. Don't deceive yourself. Later that afternoon, as I was still on campus walking down, I think it's so quaint, walking down Strawberry Lane in Orrville, Ohio at J.M. Smucker's, I was hit with the realization that this summarized every single one of the CEOs that we had identified. Every single one has embraced as a new leader the golden rule, but all of the golden rule. As ye sow, so shall ye reap, but don't deceive yourself. And think about how deep the deception exists in business. I mean, we can fool the customer. We can fool our people. We can fool our investors and shareholders. We even try to fool ourselves. If we say it over and over and over enough, therefore it must be true. Think of the deception and the deceit that again led us to where we are. Discovery number one, all of these CEOs understand, you can call it karma if you want, but as ye sow, so ye are gonna reap. That was the big discovery number one, the amazing goodness and honesty and authenticity of these people. The second thing that jumped out at us in our discovery was this. When they took over, what's the first thing they did as CEO or head of the organization? And here's what it was. Again, it bucks conventional wisdom. The first thing all of these CEOs did is they took the time to gain belief of the people in the organization. Here's the story. Big company, Hanover Insurance, just outside Boston. Been around for 100 years. For 98 years, was an incredibly successful insurance company in property, casualty, life, and annuities. Then all of a sudden, the CEO died. They replaced him with a CEO who didn't work out. He was out of there in about a year. Replaced him with a guy who had been passed over for the top job at Fidelity, brought him in, and this guy decided he wanted to make Hanover into like a Fidelity and go like that to the former bosses who had overlooked him. So we began shutting down life businesses, began shutting down property casualty businesses, concentrating only on annuities. Well, when the last stock market crashed during the dot-com bust took place, the company came this close to being taken over by the licensing authorities in Massachusetts. Enter the new CEO who's given the task of turning around this company, which was in dire, dire straits, Fred Eppinger. So on his first day as CEO, Fred Eppinger says that he wanted to get to work early, and so he wanted to get there by about 6 o'clock. So he showed up at this huge gray granite headquarters in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he says the front door was locked, and there was nobody there for security. Side doors were all locked. There were no security guys. He said he went around the back of the building, and there was one door unlocked that led to the company cafeteria. And so he said, I walked in, and there was a cook in the kitchen, some lady, and I said, good morning. I can't get in the building. Today's my first day, and can I come through this way? And she said, well, sure, I guess so if you work here. And he said, well, listen, as long as I'm in the kitchen, could you spare me a cup of coffee? And she said, well, yeah, I suppose, but what in the hell do you do here? And he said, well, I'm the new CEO. Well, predictably, she damn near dropped the carafe of coffee. And she said, I've been here 18 years. And she said, we've never seen any of the big wigs down here before. And he said, well, as long as I'm here, you want to sit down with me for a half hour and have a cup of coffee and tell me a little bit about the company? Well, you can imagine how the tom-tom drums beat in any organization. By noon that day, everybody in the company would have known that Fred Eppinger spent a half hour with one of the ladies, one of the cooks in the kitchen, talking about the company. But that really signaled what he was going to do at the company, because he says, Jason, these people had been fed every line that people can be fed. He said they would have absolute right, I mean, when anybody new showed up and said anything, to just roll their eyes back in their head and say, God, another one, how long can this last? Every one of these new CEOs took the time, the first thing they did, before they announced any plans or any strategy or made any changes, they took the time to gain the belief of people in the organization. They met individually, one-on-one, with the top couple of hundred people in the organization. They met in small groups with every single individual within the company, and they gained belief. But now think about gaining belief for a moment. If I'm to look you in the eye and say, do you believe me? I'm demonstrating a vulnerability. If you look back at me and say, yes, you're demonstrating a vulnerability, and guess what? That single shared vulnerability has brought us closer in communication than most people in business will ever get, including people who have worked together for 10, 15, or 20 years. The second thing, take it to the bank, that these people did is they worked to gain belief. Here's the third big thing that absolutely jumped out at us. Every single one of these CEOs, the next thing they did after gaining belief was they asked for help. They asked for help. Now, CEOs are not supposed to ask for help. Leaders aren't supposed to ask for help. Leaders are supposed to have all the answers. Leaders are supposed to know exactly what to do and when to do it. We've been taught that leaders are actually supposed to be very imperial. In fact, let's see if you don't agree with me. Leaders do whatever it takes to hit the numbers, secretive about strategy, demand belief, don't show any sign of weakness, see people as dispensable tools, talks instead of listens, behaves like a politician, goes whichever way the wind blows, has their plan and implements it, creates cover through complication, quick to replace the top team, imperial in nature. Well, the next thing that all of these people did is they sat down with everybody and said, I need your help. Will you help me? I think of the story of Howard Lance, who is the CEO of Harris Communications. Harris is about a $5 to $6 billion company involved in the communications business, radio equipment, telecommunications equipment all around the world. As Howard says, this has been a good company for 100 years, and it had always been a good company. He said the problem is it had never been a great company. It had always been good, but it had never been great. So the board of directors decides to go outside the company for the first time in their 100-year history and bring in an outside CEO. Now consider what this guy had going against him. First of all, 2/3 of the people who work at Harris are scientists and engineers. Now, you know what scientists and engineers like? They like to have shit proven on a chalkboard, okay? That's where they want it proven. I mean, how do you get, many, many thousand scientists and engineers on your side? The second thing is research shows that outside CEOs historically have not performed as well as inside CEOs. He was the first guy. Oh, the other thing is, a very popular internal candidate had been overlooked for the job. So that's what he had going against him when he became the CEO. Well, the first thing he did was gain belief, and then he reached out to everybody and said, I need your help. He went to the board of directors, composed primarily of former CEOs, and he said, look, I don't want you just to be the board of directors who can fire and hire me, because the worst thing you can do is fire me, and that's okay. Life will go on. But you've also had vast experience as CEOs yourself in companies. I want to learn from you. Hopefully you'll be able to teach me about things that you confronted or dealt with. And maybe you won, maybe you lost, but I could be the beneficiary of your experience. Next, he went to all the top people in the company, the top 250 people, and he interviewed them, and he just asked them questions. And the questions were, how do you think we're doing? Think we could do better? What do you think of our revenues? Could they be better? What do you think of our products? Could they be better? What about our profitability? Could it be better? And at the end of each one of those conversations, he then said, will you help me? Will you help me really create something incredible here? Again, totally flies in the face of conventional wisdom, because leaders are supposed to know, but all of these leaders ask for the help of everybody. The fourth big thing that jumped out at me was this. In every single one of these companies, they have turned what they do into the most simple of value propositions. And they work relentlessly to simplify every single thing they do. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Chicago talking to a bunch of venture capitalists. And at the end of the session, this young, late 20s, early 30s guy walked up to me and he said, Jason, he said, would you spend 10 or 15 minutes with me? We've got this great idea for this new high-tech company, and I'd really like to run it by you, and I'd like to explain it to you and tell you where we're going to get some angel money. And I said, fine, I'll tell you what, meet me in the hotel lobby in 15 minutes, and I'll sit down and spend a little bit of time with you. Well, I spent about a half hour with him. At the end of a half hour, I'm here to report, I had no idea what the hell the product was, what it was going to be, who it was going to help, what it was going to do, how it was going to be monetized. I didn't have a clue. The guy couldn't explain it in 30 minutes. You know, it used to be a pretty simple world where if you wanted to buy a house in America, you went to a savings and loan or a bank, you put a 10 to 20% down payment, they gave you the money, they kept the loan, you made a monthly payment, and when the mortgage was paid off, you got the deed for the house. But look what happens when we complicated that thing. Look, take a look. It was inevitable. It got so complicated, and the more complicated something gets, the more opportunities there are to lie, cheat, and steal, and cut all kinds of corners. All of these companies work ruthlessly to keep everything exceedingly simple, and they refuse to allow anything within their organizations to become complicated. When you think about it, business is essentially pretty simple. Why then do we work so hard to make things so complicated and fill our days with self-important, unnecessary activities that do nothing to create value for anyone? It doesn't happen in these companies. These companies keep everything very, very simple, and the proposition, the value proposition, is very, very simple. But now, let's go to the next thing they do. Every one of these CEOs, every one of them, once they had gained belief, once they had asked for help, selected an organizational destination, made sure that it was incredibly simple, every single one of them, then drove a stake into the ground and said, here's who we are, here's what we do, here's why we do it, and here are our values, and it became the reason for the existence of the organization. It became the reason for the existence of the organization. Nothing else. No, I'm sorry. If you think I said they came up with a mission statement, no, I didn't say that. If you think I said they came up with a vision statement, no, I didn't say vision statement. I mean, the problem with the V word is this. Whenever a word starts being used so frequently in business that people start to snicker every time you lose it, the word has lost its effectiveness. And a few years ago, as I was working on an article for the Wall Street Journal, I had to get a high-tech CEO from Silicon Valley on the telephone for a few minutes. I needed a quick comment. And I called down to his office and I got his assistant on the phone and I said, I need to talk to him for a few minutes. She said, I'm sorry, he's not available this morning. He's processing a vision. Give him Metamucil. It will pass quickly. And what happened is I reached up and I grabbed a dictionary because I tend to be a very literate person because I don't countenance the V word at all. I reached up and grabbed the dictionary and I looked up the definition of the word vision. Do you know the three preferred definitions for vision? Vision, number one, something supernaturally revealed to a prophet. Number two, something experienced in a trance. And number three, my favorite, something experienced under the influence of a hallucinogenic substance. So I got a picture of all these CEOs doing big doobies saying, man, come on and toke some of this stuff with me. I mean, maybe you'll get the same vision that I got. No, I did not say that these companies came up with a mission or a vision. I said these CEOs put a stake in the ground and said, this is what we do, this is where we're going, this is why we do it, and this is what we stand for. Case in point. Humana, the health insurance company. When Mike McAllister became the CEO of Humana, it had had a very storied, and not all of them good, past. Humana had started out as an owner of nursing homes, and then said, no, there's more money in owning hospitals. Oh, no, let's sell the hospitals off, let's get into insurance. And so it's an insurance company. Today it's got about 30 million insurance policyholders, but they had gone through nothing but trouble. Again, another case where a CEO had died. They brought in one, he had a heart attack, they brought in somebody else, it didn't work out, so McAllister is given the job. McAllister says, look, he said, the first responsibility of a leader is to be a travel agent, a destination expert. You better be able to explain to people where you're going and where you're taking them. He said, so once I'd gained their belief and once I had them on my side and I asked them for help, we had to figure out where we were going. And he said, we took a look at health insurance, and he said, here's what we concluded. We concluded that health insurance in America is broken irreparably. It is broken beyond repair. We went one step further, and we asked the question, can the government solve the problem? And our answer is no, the government cannot solve the problem. We asked the question, is the medical community going to solve the problem? And we decided no, the medical community is not going to solve the problem. And then we asked, are insurance companies going to solve the problem? And we decided no, insurance companies can't solve the problem either. He said that only left one group of people who could fix health insurance. And he said that's health insurance consumers. And he said there's one problem, why health insurance consumers were not fixing the problem. And he said, you know what it was, Jason? He said it's because they had no skin in the game. He said if you've got no skin in the game, you have no incentive to become a great consumer. Today, if you have health insurance at Humana, I think it's pretty exciting. You will be computer literate and be capable of opening up your health dashboard and understanding it and moving it and manipulating it, or guess what? You're not going to have insurance with Humana. End of story. And an amazing thing has happened When consumers start becoming healthcare customers with skin in the game, they open up a screen and they're shown the medications they take, what they paid per pill, but what they could pay per pill if they went 1 block away, or what they would pay per pill if they took generics. They see how many doctor's visits they had. They see the tests that they could have for high blood pressure or colonoscopies, which would actually expand their life expectancy by 17 years. Here's the bottom line. Bottom line, healthcare costs have been going up for the past decade in the U.S. on average more than double digits. Just this simple start by Humana has kept them going up at 2.5% a year. 4 times less than every other health insurance company. But McAllister says, Jason, people thought we were nuts when we started, but we had to put a stake in the ground. And he said we had to say, health insurance is broken, this is who we are, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and let's go. We found it true that every leader we identified puts a stick in the ground. And now the big one, and my favorite, because it totally flies in the face of conventional wisdom. And I bet for many of you it will totally fly in the face of many of your experiences in the workforce as well. And let me tell you how it started. I was in Chicago. I'd been hired by an insurance company to give a keynote speech to their top 1,000 leaders. I'm not going to mention the company, but it was Aetna. And I had talked with their CEO, Ron Williams, many times leading up to my speech, comparing notes, because he was going to start the day, do the first 15 or 20 minutes, then my keynote. So you want to be complimentary, so what are you going to talk about? What are your points going to be? Back and forth. I mean, you want to have a nice package there. So anyway, on the day of the conference, it's supposed to start at 9 o'clock in the morning. So by 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm dressed, I'm down there, because I want to start shaking hands while people are there for their continental breakfast. Well, at about 5 minutes before 9, all of a sudden, gong, 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 the gong's going off, move into the ballroom, we're about to begin. So I start moving into the ballroom, and all of a sudden, this young woman comes up and grabs my arm, and she says, Mr. Jennings, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going into the ballroom, it's about to start. She said, well, you're not allowed in there. I said, what are you talking about? I said, I've got a keynote speech coming up in 15 or 20 minutes, of course I'm allowed in there. She said, no, you can't go in there because our CEO is going to begin the meeting and he's going to talk for... I said, well, I know he's going to. We've been talking back and forth on the phone. He's going to mention some stuff from my speech. I'm going to mention some stuff from his speech. She said, no, you're not allowed to go in there. And I said, why not? She said, because he might mention something about our strategy during his speech, and unless you've signed a non-disclosure agreement, you're not allowed to know anything about our strategy. So I stood out in the hall for 20 minutes, cooling my jets, not allowed in the ballroom, before I went and gave my speech. Flash forward. I'm sitting at J.M. Smucker with Tim and Richard Smucker, asking the question, how have you pulled this off? And they said, well, it's very, very simple. And they took about a 60-page pamphlet. And they moved it across the table toward me. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, look at the cover. And the book says, the J.M. Smucker Strategy. I said, shit, this is cool. I said, it would be very helpful if I could borrow this during the course of my writing. Could I borrow a copy? And they looked at each other, and then one of them said, what kind of jerks do you normally hang around with? They said, you can have a copy. Take it. Make copies of the copy. Give it to everybody in the world that you want to, that you'd like to give a copy to. When people come to work here, they go to school for 2 weeks, so they learn all 60 pages so that everybody knows the strategy. I've been talking about some companies that are smaller than you. Let's talk about one that's a little bigger, the world's biggest privately held company. Koch Industries, based in Wichita, Kansas. They'll do about $130 billion this year, still led by Charles Koch. I was the first journalist and author that he's met with. I was sitting with him on a Friday, and he had a big black book in front of him. And I said, what's that? He said, that's our 5-year strategic plan. He said, you going home to San Francisco for the weekend? I said, yeah. He shoves it across. He said, take it home and read it. I said, you want me to sign a non-disclosure agreement? He said, you do know jerks, don't you? He said, no, take it home, read it, make copies, give it to whoever you want. He said, every year when we do it, we actually send one to our competitors so they can know exactly how and when they're going to die. He said, Jennings, I think you're trying awfully hard to get this, but you're just missed on a couple of cylinders. He said, it's not knowledge that's power, it's execution that's power, Jason. And guess what? When everybody has all the knowledge, you stand a much better chance of executing if everybody knows the strategy and if everybody has all the knowledge. Take a look. And so, secret number 6 I share with you is this. What we find in all of these companies, they share the strategy with everybody. Everybody in these companies knows the strategy. They go to school, not to learn how to do their job, but to make sure they understand the strategy. Now compare that to most business organizations in America, where the strategy is secret. And there's 3 things wrong with secret strategies. The first thing wrong with secret strategies is this, and any of you can go back and Google this. Google sometime the 2007 Gallup study of the American workplace by Gallup. You know what you'll find? 72% of American workers, 72% of American workers say they have no emotional connectedness to their job. 72% don't have any emotional connectedness to their job. They just show up. Well, let me ask you a question. Is that because of a bad American workforce? I don't think so. They're not emotionally connected to their job because they don't know why in the hell they're doing their job. When an organization has a strategy, but you don't know how what you do has anything to do with the achievement of the strategic goals and ambitions of the organization, you are not going to be emotionally connected. So the first reason that secret strategies don't work is because workers don't get emotionally connected. They don't have anything in the game. The second reason why secret strategies don't work is simply this. When you have secret strategies, it allows for corners to be cut and illegal activities to be readily involved in. Don't you believe that all those greedy you-know-whats on Wall Street and at the big banks, don't you think they had plenty of secret strategies? They had lots of secret strategies. And for God's sake, don't let anybody else know what our strategy is that work here, because this is our secret. So the second problem when people don't know the strategy is it allows illegal things to be done. And the third thing that happens when you've got secret strategies is this. I think this is the most obvious. Well, when the strategy is a secret, there's no accountability in the organization. Because you see, the geniuses who created the strategy, if everybody doesn't know it, and if it fails, nobody will know who created it. And maybe the genii will be able to keep their damn jobs. Now think about how that bucks conventional wisdom. That all the people have to know the strategy of the organization and understand how what they do plays a role in the strategy. I'm not sure if you'll agree with me or not. I don't need any convincing anymore. I think the last 6 months have been some of the most harrowing in any of our history. A few months ago, I was in Las Vegas about to give a speech, and I showed up for the cocktail hour the night before, as sometimes the contract says I have to do, and I was walking around the room shaking hands, and I stopped and asked one man. I said, "How are you?" He was about 58, I guess. I said, "How are you?" He said, "I'm awful." I said, "Why are you awful?" He said, "Well," he said, "let me tell you." He said, "I'm an innocent victim." He said, "I spent my entire life doing what I was told to do that was going to get me a great result. I'm this close to retirement, and guess what? It's gone. And I'll probably be working for the rest of my life." A few minutes later, I walked up to a young guy in his 30s. I said, "How are you?" He said, "I'm horrible." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, first of all, we're taking 10% across the board pay cuts." He said, "Secondly, my sister and brother-in-law in Iowa have just lost their home, moving back in with my mom and dad. My dad's got Alzheimer's, so that's going to be really cool." You know, think about what's happened. Think about where conventional wisdom and those things that we've been taught about leadership has brought us, almost to an Armageddon of our financial system. So the name of the book is Hit the Ground Running, but the subtitle says A Manual for New Leaders. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from one of my colleagues in Los Angeles. He said, "I love the book." He said, it's an incredible read. He said, the only thing I don't like is the subtitle. I said, what's wrong with the subtitle? He said, you got the wrong emphasis on the wrong word in there. He said, Jason, this is not a manual for new leaders, like people who are just becoming leaders for the first time. He said, underline new, because what you've done is it's a book for a new kind of leader. And that night in Las Vegas, I went back to my room, and I'll open it up for questions here in just a moment. But after talking to all of these people, and by the way, it's the same way that I feel. I tell people that a year ago I felt rich. Rich for me meant owning my home in California, owning our lodge in Michigan, being able to live for the rest of my life, doing whatever I want, and contributing to the things that I believe in. To me, that's wealthy. A year ago, I felt really rich. Guess what? I don't feel that way anymore. So I could identify with those people and how badly they were feeling. And I sat in my room that night and I thought, you know, if I get up there tomorrow and give a speech, and I don't mention the unprecedented financial times we're in right now, they're going to think I'm from Mars. And I sat in my room and I thought, what am I looking for? And I think that led me really to a crystallized summation of what makes these leaders that we identified so powerful. What is everybody looking for? I think everybody is looking for some degree of assurance that things are going to be okay. I think everybody wants somebody to say, you know what? We still might face some tough times. It's not easy. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we are going to get through this. I think that's one thing that a leader provides. The other thing a leader understands is this, that everybody in the world wants the exact same thing. I said it just a week ago. I was in Lagos, Nigeria. There's a lot of wealth. There's also a lot of poverty. 39 trips to India, a lot of wealth. There are more US dollar millionaires in India than there are in the total population of Australia and New Zealand together. There's also a lot of poverty. But there's 7 million people on the planet, and I know what everybody wants. I know what you want. I know what you want. I know what I want. Because I know there's nobody that woke up this morning on the planet. There's nobody in the world who woke up today and said, I want to have a worse tomorrow than today. I know that everybody woke up today and said to themselves, I want to have a better tomorrow than today. So first of all, your leaders, well, the first thing a truly great leader does is has the ability to provide some assurance that we're going to get through this together. They acknowledge that everybody wants a better tomorrow than today. The leader's role and the leader's job is to help them get there. But the third thing that a leader has to provide, see if everybody just gets some reassurance and we acknowledge they want a better tomorrow than today, and that's as far as it goes, we might as well sit around a damn campfire someplace and sing Kumbaya. Because there's one big ingredient missing, and that's the roadmap on how to achieve that better tomorrow than today. And that's the missing link that these people have cracked the code. They've cracked the code. And they've provided a roadmap for people to achieve a better tomorrow than today. Now, we've got 10 minutes for questions? 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So, this morning, the Seattle Chamber of Commerce group, they were all middle-aged and they had a lot of questions. So I would expect that, and I didn't have to wait for the first hand to go up. Why is it that you always wait while that first hand goes up and then a lot of them go up? Yes?
No, I'll be the first one.
Thank you very much.
You've talked to quite a few CEOs. Have you talked to return CEOs and what happens there? I mean, we know Apple, Steve Jobs coming back, or Michael Dell going back to Dell. I mean, we noticed that there's some dysfunctions there going on.
Right.
Do you see that, it's a danger, it's an opportunity? Have you experienced it?
Yeah, I would tell you this. I just finished authoring an article called Can They Do It Again? About the people going back for the second time, especially Michael Dell and Steve Jobs and a couple of others. I have not studied that enough in depth, but I will tell you this, that I believe the reason they're going back is because the people who succeeded them didn't do these things. I believe that that's the reason that they're being called in, and they've got to try to reprise their role. But it's something my research team is studying right now. It will never be a whole book, but we're looking at it in more depth.
Why they failed then when the second time around? Do you have a sense? Or?
I think I do. I think I do. What is the only asset that a company really has? I believe there's only one thing that gives an organization any value whatsoever. And pardon me? Well, it's popular to say people, but I think it's bigger than people. Here's what I do know. Any product or service that any company does, product, service, one day somebody's going to do it better, faster, cheaper. I know that somebody can steal your people. They can steal your advertising. They can steal your marketing. I mean, they can steal all those things. There's only one thing that no competitor can take. There's one thing, your culture. Culture is the only asset that nobody can take. And unless a leader is spending about 50% of his or her time moving the culture through the organization will eventually fail. So what happens is these organizations have incredible cultures. Somebody comes in, tries to change that culture, fails, breaks their pick, and then it's always a case of a predecessor CEO trying to come back and put the pieces together again. Why is that? It's because they hired a stupid CEO who came in and, tried to change the things that were right about the organization. Because what do cultures do? The right culture, provides purpose in an organization. The right culture provides the momentum in an organization. The right culture allows people to feel really good about themselves. I tell organizations, and I'll be right there, I tell organizations, every organization needs to do a culture test. And a culture test is real simple. Go out and ask 10 people at random in the organization to describe the culture of the company. If 10 people give you the exact same answer, man, you got a culture. But if you ask 10 people and you get 7 or 8 answers, I'm sorry, you don't have a culture then. And when you don't have a culture, one exists. And you know the culture that exists when you don't have one? That is everybody out for themselves. When you don't have a culture that people rally around, it becomes everybody looking out for their own butt or for themselves.
Okay, you talked about this, but...
And I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear it.
Why can't cultures be replicated? For example, you have Southwest. Everyone knows what they do.
I'll tell you why. The question is, why can't culture be replicated? Because people are stupid, if you want the short answer. And I'm going to give you the perfect examples because people are stupid. That's why culture can't be replicated. And here's a real world example. There is only one nationwide men's clothing brand, well known, and that's Men's Wearhouse, founded by George Zimmer. Well, what the world doesn't know is George Zimmer is a hell of a nice guy. And he really cares for people. And he really cares. In fact, I'm having coffee tomorrow afternoon with Richie Goldman, who worked with him from the founding of the very first store and is one of my neighbors. George Zimmer, when his dog died, he had a Westie. He was so broken up, he took a week off. The man's got a heart and he cares about people, the development of other people. So here, about 8 or 9 years ago, Men's Wearhouse is doing incredibly well. And it's really making the competitors angry. The competitors angry. How come we can't be like Men's Wearhouse? How come we can't get those kind of margins? How come we can't get that kind of same-store sales growth? How come we can't get that kind of longevity in the part of our people? So what they did is they sent spies into Men's Wearhouse to figure out how they did it. And they got some of their people hired by Men's Wearhouse. And the spies reported back. And you know what the competitors concluded? The reason that Men's Wearhouse is so successful is because of their commission plan. And so what did all these competitors try to copy? They tried to copy the commission plan. And it damn near bankrupted some of them because it wasn't the commission plan at all. All of these things that leaders have been taught, and I was one of them. I was one of the guys. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I'm 52, so guess what? 15, 20 years ago when people talked about HR, I was one of the first guys rolling my eyes and telling, the funny stories about the people in HR. We were told, we were taught, we were sold a bill of goods that the soft stuff doesn't count. Guess what? It turns out we were all wrong. The soft stuff is maybe the only stuff that counts. Isn't that interesting? We were told the soft stuff doesn't count, And maybe the only stuff that really counts is the soft stuff. Because I'll tell you, that's certainly where my book led me. Culture, demonstrate your vulnerability, ask for help, gain belief, value people. Geez, that's all that soft stuff that we didn't want to acknowledge or deal with for years. A couple of other questions. Yes, sir?
What are you going to work on next?
What am I going to work on next? I have always wanted to write the ultimate book on failure, on why companies fail. I have pitched the idea for a book on failure. I mean, the famous flameouts, why the big guys went down. And I pitch it consistently to my publisher. And the last time I was there, he says, come here a second, come here a second. He said, come behind my desk. He said, Google failure. So I Googled failure, and I can't remember how many millions or hundreds of millions of hits I had. He said, okay, Google success. And I did. Well, it was predictably like 20 times the number of hits for success. He said, Jason, people don't want to read about failure. People want to learn how to be more successful. You're never going to write that book. That being said, I've given him 4 bestsellers, and if you help me and get a lot of people to buy this book, and it becomes another bestseller, maybe I will get my way, and I'll be able to write my book on failure. The other thing is, predictably, for a hardcore guy like I am, because that's where I came from in business, I mean, give me results, not reasons. I mean, that's the type of business executive I was when I started out. I have stood in front of some groups and actually gotten goosebumps by looking at companies where I see half men, half women, 20% African American, 10% Asian, 10% Hispanic, and I go, oh my God, they look like their customers. And the reason they do so well is because they look like their customers. I believe that diversity equals profitability. I really believe that. So I've got an interest in diversity. I've got an interest in failure, but my publisher has told me that he wants my next book to be Launch, Launch, the greatest launches in the history of the world. I haven't gotten, I don't know. So those are the 3 possibilities. 1 or 2 quick last questions. I want to leave you time to pick up a copy of the book. Did y'all carry Microsoft credit cards at home? Yes.
Among the 10 CEOs that you interviewed, is there anyone who stands above the rest in terms of things that differently, or they all fall in the same category?
I would say, 1, they all fall pretty much in the same category, and I would say that they distinguish themselves by their authentic humility. You can't just use the word humility anymore, because in light of what's happened, everybody is going to be proclaiming a mantle of humility, and it's bogus in most cases. I'm not sure. I told this joke earlier this week and nobody got it, but I want to try it. You're younger. Maybe you will. The story is about an archbishop and a priest and a janitor who are together in a church. And the archbishop says as he stands up at the altar, I am humble before God. And the priest says, I am humble before God. And the janitor says, I am humble before God. And the bishop looks at the priest and says, look who dares to be humble in front of God, pointing at the janitor. I mean, there's a problem with humility. So I think everybody's going to be saying, I'm humble, I'm humble, I'm humble. But I think the words are authentic humility, I think. And I think they all exhibited. But there was in the part of these people, and remember, these are the guys that created the greatest economic value between 2000 and 2008. There's a guy by the name of Marshall Larsen. And Marshall Larsen is the CEO, one of the CEOs I write about, called Goodrich. And Goodrich hasn't sold a tire for 20 years. Everybody thinks of them as being a tire company. They've been out of that business 20 years. They're the largest pure-play aerospace company in the world, and a pretty incredible company. And he was telling me a story that really gave me some unique insight into him, but I believe it applies to every one of these CEOs too. He said he was out, he's got a little mountain cabin up in the Carolinas where he goes to try to get some peace sometime. And he was up there walking through the woods one autumn day with a buddy of his. And this buddy of his had worked for, Bernie Eber's company. What was it? The one upside down the phone company? WorldCom. MCI WorldCom. He'd worked for WorldCom when Bernie Ebers was there. And then Bernie Ebers didn't like him, so he fired the guy. And they were talking about the verdict that had come down for Bernie Ebers, which was life in prison. And Marshall Larson said, I looked at this guy and I said, you know what? I mean, isn't it maybe a little too much of a tough sentence that we sentence this guy to life in prison for business wrongdoings? I mean, historically, we've reserved life sentences for murderers. And this guy looked at Marshall and said, what makes you think that he isn't a murderer? And that lots of people didn't lose their lives because of his actions. And Marshall says, that changed everything for me, that walk in the woods. I think these people that we identified carry such a personal sense of responsibility for always doing the right thing that it made a profound, profound impact on me. Is there one last question? If there is, we'll take it. Yes?
Do you believe these 10 rules that you identified, they are sort of God-given to a certain person?
Do I believe that these 10 rules are what?
God-given to
God-given.
people, or can they be learned by other people?
Where are you from?
Austria.
Oostenrijk. Van wo in Oostenrijk? Van wo? Aha, okay. Do I believe these are God-given? No. I think these are taught by experience. I do not believe these are God-given. I don't believe that. I believe that these are taught by experience, and I will tell. Let me give you one final story, and this is also about Marshall Larson. It's something these people share in common, and it's something that has happened to all of us, and it's what we have to count on in our life. No, I repeat, they're not God-given. Marshall Larson grew up in Enderlin. You'll like this because it's Plattdeutsch. Enderlin, North Dakota, and Enderlin. Anybody, you don't even have to speak German, can figure it out. How did the town get its name, Enderlin? Well, it's because it was the end of the line of the railway. It was this little tiny town. So Marshall Larson grows up. He's a good student. He's a good high school athlete, works in a hardware store, and the expectation is he's going to go away to North Dakota or South Dakota State and get a 4-year degree and come back and buy the guy's hardware store. He's going to get married and have babies, and that's going to be his life. One day, a Democratic committee woman comes in and she says, have you ever thought about going to West Point? And Marshall Larson said, I've never thought about it in my life. She said, well, I can get you into West Point. She said, I'll nominate you for West Point. And he said, the next thing you know, I'm leaving Enderlin, Dakotas, and I'm flying to New York, and I'm enrolled at West Point. He said, here's what happens at West Point, Jason. The first day you're there, the first day, you bring no possessions, not even a toothbrush, nothing. What they do is they put you in a pair of gym shorts with a tag on the gym shorts, which is your name, and then they shave your entire head, and they take away your entire person, and that night you march out to this point and you're officially at West Point. I said, what did you like about West Point? He said, it was the most miserable experience of my life. And I said, why? He said, because of the harassment at West Point. I said, what do you mean? The story's in the book. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, let me tell you, the first day I'm there, he said, I'm walking across one of the common grounds, and this upperclassman says, hey, plebe, come here. And so Marshall walked over. He said, hey, my buddy's up on the 4th floor in my room. He's got a playing card. I want you to go and get it. Marshall Larson said, yes, sir, and he ran up the stairs and got the playing card and ran it back down. The guy said, go up and get the next one. And go up and get the next one. And go up and get the next one. And he made 52 trips for 52 playing cards. The harassment of plebes or underclassmen is legendary at military academies. And Marshall Larson, and it's ugly. Much of it is ugly. I just cited something, I suppose, that's not that bad. It's ugly. It's humiliating. And Marshall Larson said, it was the most humiliating and degrading experience I've ever had in my life. He said, you can't use those skills in real life. Why can you use them there? And he said, I promised myself that I would always remember the degradation I felt there, and I would never treat anybody like that as long as I lived, and it would form me as a person. And you know what? Every one of the CEOs in the book did not necessarily have business heroes, but they had anti-heroes. And they had people who had hurt them. And those experiences went with them for a long time. Were those 10 traits given to them by God? No, I think those 10 traits were given to them by experience. They were open enough to receive those experiences. and let those experiences form their goodness going forward. For all of you watching online, it's Amazon.com, please. It's been great being with you. Thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed it. And there's books in the back. And I'll come back and sign them.